I wasn't really planning on making this video, but CNBC had this 10-minute video on plastic. So let's listen to it and react to it.
Plastics recycling is failing. Globally, over 350 million metric tons of plastic are produced annually, but according to the OECD, only 14 to 18% of that is recycled. In the US, it's even bleaker. The recycling rate stands at about 8.4%, a number that has been on the decline even as the public has become more aware of the plastic waste crisis.
While we're also shocked at the amount of plastic waste we generate each day, virgin plastic production keeps increasing 4 or 5% year over year.
Problem is, most plastics just aren't recyclable, and even those that are degrade in quality each time they're remade, meaning they'll eventually end up in the landfill too.
So we can't recycle.
Did you hear how they said most plastics cannot be recyclable? Interesting, right?
Our way out of this problem.
Or can we? Mechanical recycling won't save us. That is, chopping plastic up, melting it down, and remaking it the way that we do now. Instead, the industry is betting big on something called chemical recycling, which can handle all types of plastic waste.
This new technology can take those plastics, break them down into the raw materials, and make brand new quality plastics out of them.
With governments around the world increasingly banning single-use plastics, industry groups like the American Chemistry Council are hoping that chemical recycling can save both the industry and the environment. Companies like Brightmark, Plastic Energy, and Agilix are now trying to turn plastic into fuel and plastic back into plastic.
I want to find what is the most optimal way to reduce waste and increase the environmental sustainability aspect of those products that we use.
But skepticism abounds. After all, plastic made from scratch is actually cheaper than recycled plastic. So how will the economics even work out? And can turning plastic into fossil fuels really be considered recycling? Shouldn't we just focus on producing less in the first place? It's up for debate. There are thousands of varieties of plastics, but 7 main categories, of which only 2 can be recycled by traditional means. PET, which water bottles are made of, and HDPE, used in things like milk jugs and shampoo containers. Sorting plastics and removing contamination is labor-intensive work. And so, since the 1980s, the United States, alongside other nations like the UK and Australia, sent much of its plastic waste to China, where cheap labor allowed Chinese producers to profitably recycle it. But as single-stream recycling became the norm, and plastic was thrown in the same bin as glass, cardboard, and other materials, China noticed increasingly high contamination levels. After years of warning, the country set strict new contamination limits on imports that were nearly impossible to meet, leaving wealthy nations scrambling to find new overseas markets. So why not just develop the infrastructure to deal with it locally? Basically, mechanical recycling in the US just isn't profitable without incentives or subsidies.
Virgin plastic.
So remember how I was talking about, on Aduro videos, how pretty much all of the things that is out there is like a charity exercise. They don't really work unless they're subsidized.
Plastic is incredibly cheap, and we are seeing traditional mechanical recycling operations shutting down because it simply does not pay.
But even as states like California try to prop up their curbside recycling programs and centers with subsidies, there's still just so much that can go wrong.
It's too contaminated or it's too difficult to separate, and then the recycled polymer is sort of low grade. And then on top of that, it's
also another thing that when I was talking about the big deal was most of the companies cannot recycle plastic because the plastic of contamination. And that's a big selling point for Aduro, that it is able to recycle that plastic even when it's contaminated.
It's typically too expensive.
Absent strong regulation, public pressure, or true altruism, there's just no reason why a corporation would pay more for lower quality recycled plastic.
So we need to find something else. And then, of course, something else would be switch materials or source reduction, use less. But obviously that would be bad news for the plastic industry.
Enter chemical recycling, a process that can break down any plastic, type 1 through 7, into its molecular building blocks, and then theoretically convert it into virgin quality plastic, chemicals, or diesel and petrol fuels.
There's been a huge investment in these chemical recycling technologies in recent years. They've been very hyped by industry.
The most common technology used in this process, pyrolysis, is not new.
So pyrolysis, this is when you heat it up. You heat up the plastic and you with the heat, you break the molecules. And, heat takes a lot of energy, a lot of cost. That's where, Aduro is low energy. They use water instead of heat to break down the molecules. So instead of this being like a sledgehammer, it's more like scissors that cuts the molecules.
It involves heating up a material like waste plastic in an oxygen-starved environment, which causes it to break down into a mix of simpler compounds, which are then used as building blocks for new products. But critiques abound. Tongri's organization, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, or GAIA, recently released a report which concluded that no chemical recycling facility in the U.S. is turning plastic back into plastic at a commercial scale yet, though there's been many attempts. Of the 37 chemical recycling facilities proposed in the U.S. since 2000, GAIA reports that only 3 are operational, and they're mostly turning plastic into fuel, which the organization calls the opposite of an eco-friendly solution. The companies themselves, though, beg to differ. Brightmark, founded in 2016, is building a commercial-scale plastics-to-fuel plant in Ashley, Indiana.
There are at least 14% less greenhouse gas emissions associated with the fuels that we produce versus pulling crude oil or natural gas out of the ground.
In addition to fuels, Brightmark's process also produces paraffin waxes, and Powell says the tech is ready to convert plastic back into plastic. They just need customers.
I think the market is there. We can do it now.
But in the meantime, Tongri questions whether turning plastic into fossil fuel is really a solution worth supporting.
These are not clean fuels. Whether they are absolutely the dirtiest, or they're the second dirtiest, or they're the third dirtiest, they're clearly fossil fuels.
Then there's UK-based Plastic Energy, which is turning plastic back into plastic on a commercial scale at 2 facilities in Spain.
We targeted to have a processing capacity sometime by 2023 of about 300,000 tons of end-of-life plastic.
So think about it, the capacity of 300,000 tons they're looking at by 2023, right? And the world is producing 300 million tons or something like that, right? It wouldn't even make a dent.
About 300,000 tons of end-of-life plastics per year.
Monreal says that Europe's ambitious environmental goals provide unique incentives for this type of technology to flourish.
We have commitments to double the recycling quotas in Europe from about 5 million today per year to 10 million tons per year by 2025.
As the company tries to increase its processing capacity by over 2,000% in the next 3 years, it may face competition from Oregon-based Agilix, which is also trying to turn plastics back into plastics and is looking to expand internationally. Agilix was one of the earliest companies in this space. Founded in 2004, it ran a plastics-to-fuel operation until 2015, providing jet fuel to the Department of Defense. Low oil prices forced the company to pivot, and now Agilix specializes in converting polystyrene back into styrene, which is used to make disposable cups, takeout containers, and packing foam. But GAIA has called its efficiency into question, reporting that only 1/10 of the waste that Agilix processed in 2018 was actually turned into styrene, a figure that the company disputes.
If our yields were in the 10 to 20% range, we would not have an economic plastic recycling pathway that the top companies in polystyrene have embraced.
While GAIA says the company has not proven that it's capable of recycling plastic on a commercial scale, Agilix is planning to expand its capacity across the US, Europe, and Asia, in conjunction with a number of petrochemical partners such as America's Styrenics and Ineos. Cooper says the company hasn't run a life cycle analysis to see how its recycled polystyrene compares to virgin polystyrene, but estimates the process to be between 40 to 70% cleaner. This number, too, is up for debate. But it's more than just a disagreement over statistics. Fundamentally, it's a disagreement over priorities. Basically, there's not a consensus on whether chemical recycling will represent an important part of the plastic waste solution or an expensive distraction from what many believe ought to be the real priority, making less plastic. Not surprisingly, there's big policy disagreements as well. For example, the fact that plastic industry groups enthusiastically support chemical recycling while opposing policies like single-use plastic bans or plastic taxes leaves many skeptical that the industry would ever pursue eco-friendliness over profits.
The industry is investing so much money in chemical recycling because they really want to convince us that they can continue to churn out ever large quantities of plastic and solve the problem downstream.
Well, yeah, because the plastic companies, of course, they're interested in plastic recycling technology. That's why they're talking to companies like Aduro, because if they don't solve the CNBC is showing this how massive of a problem it is, and they have in their best interest to solve this problem, to figure out recycling so they can keep generating plastic and running their business. So of course they're going to look for a solution.
Tongri and many other environmentalists believe that instead of pursuing chemical recycling, the plastic waste problem is best addressed through legislation, in particular extended producer responsibility laws that force plastic producers to bear the cost for the environmental impacts of their products. But many champions of chemical recycling support a more free market approach.
If virgin plastics cost more because there's a tax on them, that helps us out. But I think that open market competition is really the true way in the long run to foster the innovation and the efficiency to drive higher recycling rates across all plastic types.
Cooper's position is shared by industry groups like the American Chemistry Council and the Plastics Industry Association. Others, though, say legislation and chemical recycling both have a role to play.
Regulatory and governmental frameworks have really driven us to where we're at the point now where there is an absolute demand to deal with the issues of post-use plastics. What we do is already environmentally better. It will ultimately get even better as time goes on.
But for now, serious doubts about chemical recycling's efficacy, environmental footprint, and scalability remain, leading many to withhold support in favor of starting with simpler solutions.
I think there are many, many places where we could just use less plastic without compromising our quality of life. But I think it'll take a lot more than just coming up with a handful of amazing technologies to fix this.
So as you can see, the problem is big. There isn't really solutions that the world is happy with. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how Aduro progresses, and as Aduro's solutions become more and more known, how it develops. Because remember, if there's a massive problem like this, and you have a solution, there's a lot of money to be made, a lot of value to create.